Hello lovelies, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, and indeed welcome back to what may or may not be the last of the His Dark Materials retrospectives. It may or may not be the last, because this is indeed the last book in the main trilogy. But there are actually quite a few other stories out there, and indeed other books relating to this multiverse, relating to Lyra. There are also, of course, a number of different adaptations. There's the original feature film of The Golden Compass, as it was called, which, by the way, was absolutely terrible on a number of levels. I cannot even tell you how bad that film was. I will tell you, though, in one of the follow-up episodes. There's also the recent BBC series as well, which I quite enjoyed. I've got to say, I quite enjoyed that adaptation of His Dark Materials. A few minor, nitpicks, mostly relating to the presence or not of demons in this series that's almost exclusively about demons. But other than that, I thought the BBC series was pretty good, and we'll talk about that in a follow-up video. But this is the Amber Spyglass. This is the culmination not only of the story, its mythology, but it's also the point at which Pullman's intention for the book and the series crystallizes. This is where it's made fairly overt. So everything that has built up to this point, the notion of Lyra's destiny as the reincarnation of Eve, Will as the reincarnation of Adam, Mary Malone as the inadvertent serpent who has to play the tempter for Lyra in her own strange way, which in this book, it's not portrayed as a negative thing. First of all, Mary Malone doesn't even know what she's doing. She is playing the role of the serpent, of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, tempting Eve, which in this instance is Lyra. But she's not doing it consciously or with agenda. It's an innocent temptation. All she does is she talks to Lyra and tells her stories about her life. That's it. That's it. There is no wider agenda in it. And Mary Malone talks about one of her first loves, one of her first boyfriends, and how it felt and how it manifested. And that is the temptation. That is what it is. And it manifests in Lyra taking that story and applying it to her dynamic with Will. And it's kind of beautiful. It's this strange love story that actually results in grand metaphysical cataclysm. So inadvertently, Lyra ends up altering the entire metaphysics of this universe, as does Will. There's this very strange metaphysics drawn in this book in particular, where, for reasons best known unto itself, the authority and its followers are keeping the souls of the dead, not only from our universe, but from all realms, caged up. It's keeping them bound within this emptiness, this darkness, and Lyra and Will end up setting them free so that they disperse and they become dust. That's what dust actually is. It's kind of like, it's potential. In this universe, dust is its semi-sentient potential that can coalesce and ultimately becomes the life force of all realities. It's the stuff that ultimately not only holds reality together, but that becomes the essence of all living stuff and all organic things and all physical force. It is the essential matter. And that's what Lyra and Will end up freeing into the universe. She ends up making... Of course, what's been driving Lyra all this time is her guilt over what happens to Roger at the end of the Northern Lights. And via this, she ends up gaining some redemption. She ends up setting Roger free from this kind of limbo that the authority, kind of the authority, but not really. You find that out towards the end. The forces acting on behalf of the authority or in the name of the authority have have essentially cobbled together, seemingly out of sadism and cruelty and out of this desire to exercise control over all things. One of the main villains in this series is revealed in this book, and it's Metatron. Metatron, the angel that's the voice of God, is one of the principal villains in this series. Metatron is kind of the archangel who is acting as the supreme authority over the forces of the authority. So he's acting as the voice of God, and he is leading the forces of God against the forces of Azrael. And there is, in the background, this incredible war that's happening across all realities, where the forces that are dedicated to the authority, to suppression, to oppression, to systems and forces of control, are at war with the forces of anarchy and freedom and liberation. And it's just this gigantic, cataclysmic, apocalyptic war. You don't necessarily get to see much of it because it's happening in the background. Meanwhile, you've got all of these other stories going on, which are actually much simpler but much more profound and much more closely linked to what Lyra ultimately has to do. You've got the story of Mary Malone, who ultimately ends up separated from Lyra and Will, and ends up in this reality where she meets these other species called the Mulifa. For many people, I've spoken to a lot of people, and they find that it's that story that they find one of the most difficult in the series. A lot of people I've spoken to find that Mary Malone's story is kind of the point at which you start to see behind the curtain, basically. Some people have described to me that for them, this was where they felt the hand and the agenda of the author coming through too much. As we discussed in the Chronicles of Narnia retrospectives, when we spoke about how Lewis's agenda is often so overt that it dilutes the story or even overtakes the story completely. A lot of people find that happens here for Philip Pullman's series. For my part, I actually see how it feeds into the wider themes and intentions of the story. It is different from the rest of the story. The subplot involving Mary Malone and the Mulifa is actually where the title comes from, the Amber Spyglass, and it's how she manages to work out what is happening in the wider universe by interacting with these creatures from another reality. And through her own deductions, it's really unusual, really strange. It's very peaceable compared to most of the rest of the book and most of the rest of the story, which is tied into this wider notion of prophecy and destiny and Lyra's purpose and the war, the metaphysical war. And I can see why people regard it as maybe as a diversion, or as a point at which the story maybe softens, where it actually levens out a little bit. I actually quite like that myself. For my tastes, I actually quite like it, and I like the way that eventually feeds into what Mary Malone has to do regarding Lyra and her story. But I do understand it does become more sedate at that point. It kind of softens out a little bit. And in contrast to stories like, for example, Marissa Coulter's plot, which is really bloody interesting in this one. I mean, this is the point at which the sins of Marissa Coulter and Lord Azrael culminate. And they realise that they are not the be-all and end-all, that actually what they've been all the way through are facilitators for Lyra's destiny, and that they not only have some redemption to perform as her parents, at which they've totally failed, but also in that regard, they have to do certain things that will distract and draw the eye of the authorities' forces while Lyra and Will are performing their their necessary purposes, because if they don't, then the agents of the authority will ultimately track them down and end up destroying them, and thereby stop this entire process of multiversal liberation that's happening. It's shaking all of reality to its foundations, even though Will and Lyra don't really know it, and really don't get any sense that that's what they're doing at all, ever, at any point. That's what's so wonderful about it. It's not like, it's not like Harry Potter, who is told, it's because the story of Harry Potter is so poorly written that you've got to have characters telling the main character and thereby telling the reader that this is the case. That's not how this happens. It's very subtle. They have to allow Lyra to follow her own intuitions and her own urges. She has to be herself. She can't just be a puppet of destiny. That's not how it works. Otherwise, obviously, the entire notion of liberation, of emancipation, means nothing. It's just another system of control. It's another form of slavery. And that's really wonderful. That's a really clever quality to this book. It takes the notion of the chosen one, which is a massively overwrought trope that occurs throughout Western mythology, and it inverts it. It turns it on its head. It's really clever, really bloody clever. But yeah, Lord Asriel and Marissa Coulter do get their moment of redemption, and it's quite brilliant. It really is quite brilliant. I mean, you get to see just how powerful these characters are in their humanity. They wager their humanity against an angel, against Metatron, the archangel, the most angelic of angels, the most powerful, the one that is next to God. They end up ranged against him as human beings, and they win. They end up winning. I mean, it ultimately means that they sacrifice themselves, but they end up winning, and that's very beautiful. Not by winning, by removing themselves from the state of play, they also remove themselves from the path of Lyra's destiny, because there's every chance that if Asriel had survived, or if Coulter had survived, they would have ended up just becoming the next authority. They would have just become another icon and system of oppression and control. Their agendas would have taken over. Their intentions would have been the blueprint for what reality becomes after this point. And Pullman very cleverly just removes them, because that's how it has to be. And cleverly, they realize it. They understand that that's the way it has to be. The parents, the previous generations, and their sickness have to remove themselves. There's actually a wider commentary here on dynamics between parents and children, between previous generations and their offspring. It's a very powerful message. It is the polar opposite of the one that Lewis gives, which of course is that children should bow to the authority and wisdom of their parents in all things and of their forebears, and that children should not trust their own intuitions and their own urges and their own instincts. They should ignore them, or they should suppress them. This is the opposite of that, and it's really, really beautiful. It's a message of emancipation that is massively inspiring. If I had children, I would like them to read this series, because I think it gives children, unlike Lewis, unlike the Chronicles of Narnia, and unlike a lot of fantasy fiction, quite frankly, it gives children this license. It actually extols to them the virtue of being children and of being curious and of wanting to break the world that their parents have given them. And it tells them, you know what, that's probably a good thing. That's probably a good thing. The story is also incredibly sad. It's also incredibly sad on a number of levels. I mean, there's the love story which occurs between Will and Lyra, which is really, really beautiful, but is so brief. It's so brief because, of course, they learn that the doors that have been carved with the silver knife, the subtle knife, are what have leached dust away from the various realities. Dust flows through these cuts, these doors that have been made in reality, and it's slowly causing these realities to fray apart. So all of the doors need to be closed, and Will needs to go back to his reality, and Lyra needs to go back to hers. and they have to be apart, unfortunately. Interestingly, also, Lyra goes through this metaphysical shift where, unlike most of the people from her reality, her demon, Pan, and her become one entity. She's one of the only people from her reality that doesn't have a demon. She's very strange in that regard. You know, she actually becomes one with her demon and becomes a more rounded human being because of it. She becomes something very strange in her own reality, but something that is more than those whose demons, whose essences are kind of separate from them. It's sad and beautiful at the same time. It's really wonderful. The conclusion to his Dark Materials is fantastic. It really is. The portrait of God here is very interesting as well. All this time we've been told that the authority, with a big capital A, is the grand nemesis, is the one that the magisterium operates in obeisance to, who is dictating all of these oppressive forces across the face of reality. And we find out that's not true. The authority has been basically a prisoner for so long, and is portrayed as this weak, feeble, broken, ancient thing, which Lyra and Will ultimately end up freeing. To its gratitude, it dies. They give it the freedom to die. This most ancient of all creatures, they give it the freedom to die, which it's never had before. It has been sustained down the eons by those who have an agenda operating in its name. They've never been operating in its name. Never. They've always been operating with regards to their own intentions and agendas and using the name and the image of the authority to further that. And it's kind of brilliant, I've got to say. It is kind of beautiful. They allow the authority to die. God dies, essentially. God has to die in this story for it to make sense. Again, completely contrary to C.S. Lewis's work, in which God is everything, is absolute. God essentially kills everything else, you know? It's so beautiful. It's such a great series of books. And I've kind of talked myself into wanting to read them again now. Or maybe listen. I like listening to them on audio, actually. I think these books work particularly well in an audio format. If you have children, these are some of the best books to read with them, I've got to say, because you will be entertained as well. You know, they're complex enough that adults can get a great deal out of them. And they are unpatronizing and uncondescending enough that they talk to children as human beings, and the lessons they provide are inspiring and beautiful and wonderful, as opposed to C.S. Lewis's didactic, finger-wagging, oppressive and denying lessons. These are emancipatory, they're liberating and beautiful and inspiring. It's a gorgeous series of books. It's a really sincerely beautiful, gorgeous series of books, and I cannot recommend them more highly. I really can't. I think they are stunning. Well, that was really wonderful. It was really wonderful to revisit these books, I've got to say, and now I want to go reread them again. When we come back, my loves, I will take a look at the Golden Compass film, and we will also take a look at the BBC series, as well as some of the offshoots and other stories set in this universe. Until then, my loves, bye-bye.